Welcome to the Igniting the CEO Within podcast, where we interview successful high-level professionals to discover lessons they've learned throughout their career that can help ignite that CEO within you. I'm Mark McFatridge, and I'll be your host for the next 15 minutes or so. Our show is sponsored by Quaid, a nationwide community of CEOs and entrepreneurs. Quaid has developed Launchpad, which offers an opportunity for experienced executive coaches to become licensed circle directors. After completing the Launchpad program, you'll lead your own peer advisory circles, helping other CEOs and entrepreneurs excel in their professional and personal lives while providing a community of support, accountability, and challenge. If you'd like to learn more, visit us at quaidcircle.com. Really excited about our show today. Maybe a little bit different than some that we've done, but I think it'll be a powerful episode. I have the opportunity to get to sit down with Tom Hammergren. He's an author, lyricist, musician, and cancer thriver from Loveland, Ohio. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Look
Hey,
forward to the talk today.
yeah, I am too. Hey, you've had just a whirlwind of a life and full of experiences. You've seen a lot and you're going through a lot. And I would just love for you to kind of share your story, and we'll turn it into some leadership lessons at some point. But I think your story is really fascinating. I'm really really excited for you to share it with our listeners.
Sure. Well, let me start out because my current title is the stuff that you sort of talked through. But if I really look at my career, I'm one of these kind of guys that always says that I was present with a few lightning strikes in high tech industry mostly, where I've tended to be more on the innovative startup side of things. So whether that's incubating and creating a product to almost transform a large public company, or starting from scratch from, seed investors through the VC route. I've done most of those types of things. So with companies with names like Cognos, which are now part of IBM, or Sybase, which is now part of SAP, or actually I was a general manager at a company called Divine that went through bankruptcy. Most of the entities ended up surviving out of bankruptcy. And my most recent was at a company called Patient Point. And in all of those, I've been sort of in the analytical space, and really, spanning a career that's marketing, product management, general manager, COO, CEO, sort of climbed the path. Although I never really fell in love with a job, I fell in love with what we were doing. So I was one of those kind of guys that would take a lateral move or step down and start, rolling up my sleeves and start from scratch. Personally, I've been married for 41 years in April. I have 2 kids, 4 grandkids, all sort of close. So we're a pretty close knit bunch. So that's just a little background on me. If we really look at this, I think, when you and I started talking, it was like, I have since retired, which is the new title that you sort of gave me on LinkedIn. Um, and I started trying to think about, what would make sense to sort of help other people. And I think it's really that, what's that trigger that drives you to retirement? And personally, I'm 65, so I'm still young enough to really be working. And on my personal journey, the thing I will tell you is that I've been diagnosed with cancer twice. So part of the reason I'm a cancer thriver is I'm sitting here, this is what stage 4 lung cancer looks like, is the way that I would look at it. In August of 22, I was diagnosed and I had the cancer was in both lungs, the lymph nodes in between, a bunch of the back ribs, my ileus on the right side, my pelvis on the left side, and I had 7 lesions in my brain. So basically head to tail is the way I would think of it. And the doctor said, a guy in your condition probably has got 18 to 24 months. I ended up working 3 years beyond that diagnosis. So I always call this naive exuberance, where it's like, I think as leaders, we've been taught so much about taking people into the dark woods that nobody's ever been and having no fear, that to say that I didn't have shock or didn't have fear would be lying to you. But there's something in me that just, flipped the switch and said, okay, I'm going to figure this out, fight it, and keep moving. But I think one of the things that becomes very important, I guess, as another backdrop for this, I probably should say in 2020, the COVID year, I was actually diagnosed with stage 3B lung cancer. So it was pretty much predominantly in one lung and the lymph nodes in between the lungs. And I did chemo and radiation, and it didn't do anything. It shrunk the primary tumor by like a millimeter. And I started researching. I had a bunch of buddies that did research too and sent it to me. And I found a bunch of alternative protocols, one which I committed to. And in 30 days, I woke up sleeping on my left side, which I hadn't been able to do because that's where the tumor was. And in 60 days, we had our scans, the scheduled scans, and the primary tumor had shrunk by 50%. In 150 days, it was gone.
Wow.
And all my oncologist could say is, I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing what you're doing because it's working. So, I've really been fighting this cancer battle since 2020. And I don't think really until it was probably early 2024 that my inner voice started saying, and at that point, I think it said, if you have 5 years left, is this what you want to do? So even the doctors had told me, what they felt. I said, well, how many people live beyond that time period? And they said, well, about 10%. And I said, well, I'm in the 10% group. But I think the thing to take from this, and I don't know that this is necessarily meant to be something that's a lesson for, somebody that's suffering from cancer or some other chronic illness. There's a voice inside of our head that a lot of times we compartmentalize and push away. But when you start hearing that voice that starts saying it's time, I think that becomes a very important moment because people need leaders. And if your head is telling you to stop and you're listening to that, more than likely you're taking your eye off the ball of leadership. And that will show because people just have to have somebody that's sort of guiding them, in my opinion. And so I think the biggest challenge, at least that I faced, and I will tell you that I was an athlete. I was an All-American swimmer, swam through college, made the '81 national team. So I'm probably strung a little bit different than most people. But when the voice started entering into my head, it was like, well, what's next? And I think the biggest challenge that I've talked to people about through this is one of the bigger problems we have is our ego and our job history and or title over time become one. And that's a problem because when you say, I'm going to quit a sport, so I'd sort of experienced this with swimming, you lose a little bit of your identity because I was a swimmer and now I'm not a swimmer. So I always had programmed myself to say, well, what's my next act? And the reality from swimming is I converted my athleticism to business, and that became my battleground. So as I started going through this, inner voice sort of hit me and saying, I think it's time. And a lot of that was focused on, exhaustion and pain episodes that I would have, and it was just very difficult to work through. That I had to really start working on what that separation looked like. So if I had to walk through it, I think there were key steps. One, I had to convince my boss because he was like, you beat it once, you'll beat it again. And I had to keep going back to him and saying, but if I'm out for long periods of time or have to go on short-term leave, who's going to lead the team? And he said, well, I got bandwidth, I'll do it. Well, as I would go out and I would come back and chaos would ensue. I'd be saying, what did you do? And he's like, well, I didn't really have time, but I think they got through it. So I started looking at that and I finally convinced him that we needed to find my successor because we didn't have naturally somebody on my staff, which, I'd only been on the job for, probably 2 years. So we had sort of blown things up. It was a murder situation and we were rebuilding. And so I had a pretty young management team that couldn't really sort of pop up to that level. So we found, likely candidate. We brought them in. We said, you're going to be my number 2. But I immediately sat them down and said, do whatever you do your 90-day listening tour and look at the organization and then come back to me with what your plan is going to look like. And everything is open. And that was sort of hard because it's like, man, I've busted my butt to sort of get the team to where we are, the vision of where we are and everything else. And now somebody else is going to come in and have a different vision, different structure. So I struggled a bit with that, but I stuck with it and worked with it really quite well. And then we started the reorg and I started moving things over. And I will say that the voice started getting louder as I started doing that. And that's when I started realizing that I was so tied to my title because I was handing stuff off and I was basically in the process of demoting myself to be an advisor of my successor until such time that I said I was going to walk out the door. And I will admit that I escalated that path by a year because things were working out well enough. And so with cancer, I had in my mind that I wanted to write a book to sort of help people deal with the mental aspects. So it's like when you start out, you have shock. Well, how do you accept that you have cancer so you can fight the battle? And as soon as you accept it, then you go into fear. It's like, well, how do you get the courage to fight? And you have various other things, anxiety, depression, loneliness, helplessness. There's a bunch of those things. So I started framing up the book in the moments that I wasn't working. And all of a sudden, I started talking to more and more people about that. It was like, wow, this is what my next mission is. It's how do I transition from work life into life's work and really sort of help people with this stuff. So I think the lessons that I look at this is, as you start making that transition, you got to figure out what that next step is going to be. Now, with me, part of the trap was people started saying, oh, geez, he's leaving. Would he come be a consultant for us and help drive business? Or would he be a board member? And I think at some point, you got to make that decision that you're going to switch. Because what I'm doing now is dramatically different than what I was doing when I was working. But I've said to many people, I don't know that I have time to actually fit a job in now. So with my job, I was lucky enough to be attached to Patient Point. If people don't know it, if you go to your doctor and there's a screen in the waiting room doing educational content, and every now and then shows an ad, it's more than likely Patient Point. So, that's what we did, but we had a huge cancer practice. And so I got introduced to several people, one being Johnny Emmerman from Emmerman Angels. And they have a business model that connects sort of your cancer twin, if you want to think of it that way, that has preceded you with cancer that you can, have mentor. So I told him about this book and he was like, this is awesome because it's like a 24/7 mentor that could be on the bedstand that somebody could come in and flip to a chapter and say, I'm having anxiety. How do I deal with it? And I said, it'd be really good if we got a group of people that are cancer thrivers or late stage people that had beat it and have them participate. So anyway, that last year that I was working, that started gathering momentum, and then I got a publisher. So that's why I sort of said, okay, I'm going to shift my timeline because the organization was doing fine with a new leader. I had sort of run my course. I could still work there if I wanted to. But that time was just, it was just telling me more and more it's time to walk away and sort of shift gears and go into the new stuff. Yeah. So I left last January. Of course, when I left, I immediately went into the hospital for like 3 weeks, got really sick, but immediately jumped on the book. And, I had 27 people that committed to doing the book. I think there were 10 to 12 regulars out of the 27 that participated. The book should be out, I don't know, in a month or two.
Wow.
On the shelves. But that took my first year, and that was like herding cats. Um, aside from just getting used to the timing of retirement, what you do with life in general. Um, so that's sort of the high level story of where I've been and where I'm going.
Tom, it's an amazing story, and it stands on its own. And not trying to take everything and make it a leadership lesson, but I find it interesting that you being a high level athlete, you taking that mentality into the business world and having success and continue to drive that, and then elevating to the highest levels in everything that you've done. When you're going through all that, you never think about um, having a chronic illness that takes all that away from you. Walk me through kind of what that thought was, or what that realization felt like when the doctor came to you and said, "Hey, here's where you are. The first one was level 3 lung cancer, and then level 4 lung cancer." What was that feeling like that you heard that?
Um, well, I'll take a step back. Swimming is a weird sport if most people don't pay attention. But the thing I always look at and say is the person that's number 25 in the world versus the person that's number 1 in the world probably has nothing to do with physical
Hmm.
aspects of that person. It probably has to do with their mind. And so as a swimmer, you spend a lot of time visualizing. And I used to always joke, I'd sit in a corner with a stopwatch and a grease board and sort of envision at the end of the year what my race would look like, and I'd be within hundredths of a second of my split. So I got pretty good at that type of stuff. And I always joke and say, I wish I could have visualized myself faster than what I did. But I think as I got into, leadership at higher levels is a lonely job. There's not a lot of mentoring that you have on site. You have to find mentors outside of your organization to help give your psychotherapy when you need it, motivation.
Mhm.
And especially with innovation and startups, you're going in places not a lot of people have been. So you hear the words no and, this is impossible and everything else. But I would tell you that I was a huge visualizer as to where I was going. So when this did happen, to your point, it's not something you envision. But I'm also a realist that tended to look and say, over the last couple of years, I've started seeing some weird stuff.
Hmm.
Like I'd be giving a speech or something and my voice would just totally stop. And quite honestly, the first diagnosis was I had a paralyzed vocal cord and they had to do a thyroplasty, which they put an implant in to just basically jam the thing to the center line so that you can get a little more power in your voice. So when that started happening, I started doing more research. And of course, I went to the doctor and the doctor said it's allergies. And like, okay, I haven't gone to the allergist in a while. I'll go to the allergist. The allergist's like, I think it might be asthma because your lung capacity. down. And I think somewhere one of them said we should do a chest X-ray, and I was like, that isn't stupid. It's just
Right.
I was cheering for a kid, or so I think there's a lot of that denial that really happens, and that isn't good
Hmm.
because it's like, you're on the front of it. It might have been stage two when I started discovering it, and I ignored it probably for 18 months. I was at a Christmas party and I was totally hoarse. My wife was having to interpret for me, and people said, you need to go see an ENT right away. And then, they discovered that I had this paralyzed vocal cord, and they said, we need to figure out why. And we did a CT, and they found a tumor in the lung. I never realized this, but educational moment. The nerve for your vocal cord loops around behind your lungs. So the tumor was sitting
Huh.
on it, which is why I was going hoarse. So to me, it was the big slap across the face that woke me up and said, life is here. Because up to that point, it was like burning in that wick. If you've got to travel, all week, and, you got to leave on Sunday and get home on Saturday, so be it. So luckily I've got a great wife that's been a rock behind me. And as I said, we've been married for 40 years. But I think there's a lot of denial that really happens
Hmm.
when that happens, and you are immediately brought into a crisis point. So the one thing I will say is leadership helps you in crisis moments make decisions. And so, you immediately go into action, but now all of a sudden you've got this split directive.
Hmm.
You've got what your day life is, and then you got your personal life. So that's a real challenge because you got to try to figure out how to splice it. Now, the first diagnosis, I was at a different job and I had a more senior staff, so I could take, time off and have them run it and not worry. The second time, it was really a challenge because I didn't have the senior people that, I could be absent as much. But I think that's the hardest part is, to your point, you don't envision any of that. I mean, hell, I was going to work till I was 70, 75,
Right.
who knows what. And then all of a sudden it wakes you up, and then you start, in my case, I just started looking and saying, it's like that Tim McGraw song, I don't remember what it was called, but it's like, if this is the time you've got left, is this the way you're going to live it? Or, are you going to do a countdown to death, or are you going to sort of say, I'm going to live my life to its fullest to whenever it ends? Um, so I think it's key that mentally you get your head in order when something like this happens. And unfortunately, our job tends to pull us away from being able to make personal decisions at times.
Thank you for that. I think one of the things that's fascinating to me is that some of the things that people identify as being I don't know, a bad trait about leaders is that they're able to just look forward, right? Not think about what got us here, but they're focused on moving forward all the time. And they don't pay attention to history. They don't care how they got here. It's just about what's next. How do we get to that next piece? And seemingly, that's actually been a positive for you after this diagnosis is you're like, all right, well, that sucks, but I'm gonna kick its ass. I'm gonna figure it out and I'm gonna
Yeah,
attack it and go down swinging. And so again, I think sometimes leaders get a maybe a bad reputation or bad connotation of, yeah, they don't have a heart, they don't think about all this stuff. They're just always moving forward and they don't take time to smell the roses and appreciate the journey and all this kind of stuff. They're always looking forward. I think that's what saves us in a lot of situations, and I think that's
yeah,
what's happened to
it's
you.
it's it's interesting. In 2020, I was working at a health system, and I have to admit it was like oil and water because I was a startup guy and it was a mature business that wanted to tell me what to do. But the beautiful thing is you had a lot of people that were involved in the medical community, and I had One of their regional chief medical officers became sort of a mentor because he had prostate cancer. And I remember telling him my plan. It's like I just found out I got diagnosed. I'm going to do this, do this, do this. And he
Yep.
said, Tom, slow down. You've got to take it one day at a time because cancer will raise its ugly head when it wants to, and you have no control. And so I was lucky enough to have people like that in my life that really started helping me shape it, because I think that's the other thing. As a leader, you've always got a plan A, B, and C, right? If A is failing, I know exactly what B is, so I can
Yep.
instantly pivot and turn on a dime. And you're always playing out scenarios in your head to say, I believe the path we're on, but if it doesn't work, how am I going to do the next thing? And you're ready for that. And people are like, well, how do you move so fast? And that's the bigger challenge with health problems is it's not really, some things are in your control, but not all things are in your control. And you got to realize that, and you got to make room for those things. But all that being said, I still feel like mentally, as the physical thing starts taking hold mentally, it starts destroying you.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I look at it and say the practices that we've done as leaders, whether we acknowledge it or not, of having a strong mind to deal with, down periods. Because I think a lot of people look at leadership and say, oh, it's all, glory and so on and so forth. And the reality is, to use a bad word, I used to always tell people shit rolls uphill, not downhill, even though they feel it rolls the other way. So
Right.
it's like every day you're dealing with the newest crisis. It's not like every day you're dealing with the best situation. So I think a lot of that prepares you if mentally you stick to it. And I think that's the biggest problem is, do you let this be a big enough blow to you that it breaks your mind? And I think we as leaders have learned how to fight those types of battles. So
Yeah.
maybe that's me. I don't know.
No, yeah, I think you're dead on. I think yes. I mean, you're dead on. You're dead on. Hey, I want to make sure that we get an opportunity to highlight your book. And I know it's not out yet, but what's the name of the book?
It's called Life After the Shadow.
Life After the Shadow.
So shadow being an analogy for the cancer. And I will tell you that the book is very faith driven, spiritual driven. So the subtitles is Spiritual Guide to Hope and Renewal After Your Cancer Diagnosis or something like that.
Yeah.
And I'd written 3 other books that were more technical in the analytics space. One was Data Warehousing for Dummies.
Mhm.
And one of the important things that writing a dummies book taught me is that you write it, dummies books patterns are like 20 chapters of introduction. So people don't have to start with chapter 1. So that's really the way this is written. It sort of introduces what I would say are the participants or the people that have had cancer. But each chapter focuses on one of these transitions that you need to make. So shock to acceptance, fear to courage, anxiety to calm, those types of things. And what it starts out with is a set of scripture that allows you to see how in the scripture similar methods exist. But then it quickly gets into the participants because I want to talk about how it's bad to be in the bad state. Like if your body's in shock, it does a lot of stuff to fight that doesn't allow it to fight cancer, as an example. And we all go through it. So what I was wanting to do with the people that were participating is I really prompted them to sort of give me the strategies. What triggered them to move into that state? What did they do to move out of it? Because most of us stay in that state for a very small period of time and can get on and move it to sort of fight the battle. And then it's got some sort of workbook type stuff at the end of each chapter to help you reflect on what the chapter's contents were and ask questions of yourself to sort of figure out how you're going to transition. So it should be out. I'm thinking it's probably 4 to 8 weeks. The publisher just came back and we're through page design, so I think we're on cover design next.
That's
and
great.
and then it should hit. And it'll be paper book, ebook, and we're going to do an audiobook.
Nice. Nice. Well, thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your story and being so vulnerable and weaving some leadership lessons into everything that you've lived to date, and super excited about your book, and certainly will make it available to our audience when it becomes available. So Tom, thank you so much for taking some time and sharing your story with us on our podcast.
Thank you for having me. Hopefully it helps somebody. And I always throw this out to people. If somebody's in a similar situation and struggling, by all means, reach out to me. If I have time, I definitely would love to spend time with somebody to help walk them through. I can't make decisions for people, but I can sort of tell them what I've been through and what's worked. And I think all that gives people hope as to where they can go.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, thanks again. All right, y'all. What an amazing episode of Igniting the CEO Within. So proud to be able to share stories like Tom's to help everybody as they go through life as a CEO or on the way to the CEO. It's not always scripted, and you've got to be able to figure out how to react. So thanks again for listening. Until next time, keep igniting that CEO within you. I'm Mark McFatridge.